Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Made of Millions YouTube channel. Thank you so much for joining me today. For those of you who are new, my name is Teodora Pavkovic. I'm a psychotherapist and a parenting coach, and I'm one of the advisory board members of Made of Millions. And this is the third series of what we've called the Teodora Talks Tech show, if you will. During the first one, I was addressing the topic of digital wellness, which was why we decided to call this Teodora Talks Tech. Each one of the series so far has consisted of 5 episodes, and you can go back and watch those again. So the first one was dealing with digital wellness and some of the different aspects of practicing digital wellness. In today's world, I addressed parenting, I addressed individual tech use, and a whole number of other things. The second series was dealing with positive psychology, which is one of the other topics that I feel very strongly about and that I have a huge interest in. And so with that one, I touched some of the topics around how we can practice positive psychology and what are some of the kind of the perspective shifts that positive psychology has brought into the general field of psychology. And then in thinking about doing this third series, I really wanted to kind of boil down some of the topics that I've talked about so far. And again, separate this out into 5 episodes, each of which I'm going to use to talk to you a little bit about one particular self-care practice that I think is incredibly valuable, kind of on the best of days, but I think especially now, given everything that is going on in the world. And so that's what this particular series, the third series, is going to be about. You can think of it as a kind of a self-care toolbox. And during this first episode, I want to talk to you about a topic within emotional intelligence, and that is emotional diversity. Now, we're streaming live on both YouTube and Facebook. Given that I'm a one-person team at the moment, I will be able to address any of the questions or comments that are coming in through the Made of Millions YouTube channel, but not the Facebook one at this point. If you do want to leave any comments or questions, though, and you're watching us live on Facebook, please do that. I will just not be able to answer them live for you, but I will make sure to go back after this episode wraps up, and I will address as many of your questions as I possibly can. You can also see on the ticker at the bottom of the screen some of the other different ways in which you can get in touch with me. You can also head over to my website if you'd like any more information about me, and you can always email me as well if you have any further questions. So thank you all again for those of you who joined us after we kicked off. This is the third series of Teodora Talks Tech, and I will be talking to you about self-care practices, and we're going to dive into emotional intelligence and emodiversity with this first one. So I thought a pretty good place to start would be to share with you some of the emotional truths about our emotions, or at least what I consider to be some of the most important emotional truths as we think about how we can better regulate our emotions, because that is really the main idea behind all of this. And for those of you who are watching us who are parents, you know that is pretty much your number one job when it comes to parenting your children. It's really to teach them how to regulate their emotions. It's a hard task, even for adults, let alone for children. And so I want to share a few of these with you that I think are really important and that I think will kind of help get you started with learning how to regulate your emotions a little bit better. So the first one I think is probably one of the most important ones, and this is one that I often mention when I teach and train on positive psychology. And so if you saw my second series on positive psychology, you know this to be one of the big emotional truths, and that's the fact that being happy either most of the time or all the time does not equal emotional health. So being emotionally healthy does not mean being happy all the time. And this is a really important one that I always want to make sure I share very early on in any of my teachings, because I think that's a really important expectation that we need to set in an appropriate, healthy kind of a way. If we set our expectation at happiness that we're going to feel most or all of the time, we are definitely going to fail. That's not even a question. And so to begin with, I always like to kind of set the expectations right and set them straight, and talk about the fact that we're not really aiming for that. We're not aiming for happiness. And we could spend hours talking about this from a more kind of philosophical perspective. Those of you who are interested and who practice mindfulness, who know a little bit about Eastern traditions, Buddhism in particular, will know that a lot has been said and written about this topic of aiming for happiness and always missing that goal if that is what you set as your aim, right? So that's kind of the first truth. The idea is not to be happy all the time, nor does being happy all the time mean that you're emotionally healthy. That's not really what it's about. This is one that I think is really important as we talk about introspection and as we talk about self-awareness and self-knowledge and just understanding ourselves a lot better. One of the kind of the primary or the foundational steps of emotional intelligence is really being able to look inward and understand what is happening, understand what you find in there. And so for that reason, it's really important to understand that you can feel more than one emotion at any time. Within the field of emotional intelligence, we talk about primary emotions and we talk about secondary emotions. The secondary ones sometimes we call meta emotions, so META, meta emotions. It is very possible, for example, for you at this point during while we're still in lockdown, during quarantine, during this global pandemic, if you are experiencing pretty good health and you're safe and so on, it is possible to feel very grateful, very thankful for that, to feel pretty happy about that, and at the same time feel guilty about the fact that you're feeling happy about being safe and being healthy, because there's so many people around the world who are not happy and they're not healthy and they're not safe at this point. They're pretty much the exact opposite. And so our emotions don't just stop with that kind of initial emotion. Because we're human beings, because our brains are so incredibly complex, we'll often feel secondary, sometimes maybe even tertiary emotions, although that's too complicated a topic to go into right now. But as you're kind of trying to regulate your emotions better and trying to understand yourself a little bit better, don't be surprised if you find that it's actually not just one thing that I'm feeling. There's a few different things going on here. There's a little bit of sadness, but there's a little bit of fear. There is a little bit of kind of joy and positivity as well. Don't let that kind of confuse you or throw you off. It is perfectly normal and it's perfectly natural. And kind of the more complex our circumstances are, the more likely it is that we're going to experience that. And so a lot of, I think, the kind of the personal confusion, the inner confusion that the world is experiencing right now is precisely because of this reason, because it's not only that there's so much going on around us, there's a lot going on inside of us as well, partly because we're kind of physically constrained to very, very small spaces. So you can feel more than one emotion at a time, and that is completely normal if you do. This kind of idea and statement, I think, is really important and makes it a lot easier for us to give ourselves some self-compassion when we have a hard time understanding what's going on inside, and when we have a hard time figuring out what we're feeling exactly and why we're feeling it and how we're going to regulate it and how we're going to communicate it. And that is because emotions were essentially our first language long before we had the hieroglyphs, long before we had any other way of communicating with each other, long before we were able to draw things on cave walls. Our emotions were the way in which we communicated with each other. So I think it's really important for us now in the year 2020 to kind of understand the fact, be aware of the fact that we're using modern verbal oral languages and traditions in order to try and kind of explain and manage a language that is absolutely ancient and that existed long before any of us were really aware of the fact that we were human beings and before we were aware of all the things that we're aware of now. And this was incredibly important because, of course, as human beings, hundreds and thousands of years ago, we lived in tribes, right? You would never see a human being alone by themselves. They wouldn't be able to survive for very long. So we lived in these clusters around the world. Many people still do. We could argue that in some ways, some of these tribes have kind of transferred into the virtual world. But we needed to be able to communicate primarily danger to each other. And so if you can imagine all of us being part of a relatively small tribe, if you were the first one to detect that there was a wild animal approaching us, or that there was a storm that was about to come in the distance, or if you just tasted some food and you noticed that it smelled a little bit strange, or it tasted like it might be poisonous, so you experienced disgust, you would have to be able to communicate that with me and the rest of our tribe in order to protect us, in order to save us. So it was really a survival mechanism. And so it was the first language that we ever used in order to communicate to other members of our tribe what we were thinking, how we were feeling, what things we were noticing happening around us, happening kind of in the world around us. And it was a very pro-social way of connecting to each other. Right? For the most part, it was a coping mechanism. And so I say all of this just to give you that kind of historical, and it's even more than a historical perspective. It's really a kind of ancient perspective of what emotions were really all about at their very kind of foundation or inception, if you will. They were a way of communicating with each other. And the way we did that was really, again, before we were able to speak, was through our facial expressions. It would have been through the tone of our voice, even though we weren't able to kind of legibly speak yet. But it would have been through the tone of our voice, through grunts or screams or whatever it may have been, and through our posture, and through our gestures as well. So emotions are incredibly old, is the bottom line there. And I touched upon this already with this previous point, but emotions are also messages. And you'll hear different psychologists, different neuroscientists kind of framing this in a slightly different way. But the bottom line is that they hold information and their data. Sometimes they are directions, but not always. But the most important thing to remember is that they do hold information. They have some kind of a message. So in that previous example where we're all living in a tribe and you taste some kind of a berry or a meat or something that tastes like it might be poisonous, or it might have gone off, or whatever it is, you're experiencing disgust, and your face would kind of form that typical disgust expression because your body has now realized that it may not be a good idea to eat this. But also for those of us who are around you at that point, because again, remember, we're living as a tribe, we're detecting the message that you're sending us through your facial expressions and probably your physical posture as well, that it's not a good idea to eat that. That's a relatively simplistic message and a relatively simple emotion and a relatively simple circumstance. Again, in the year 2020, things are a lot more complicated, which is why it's so difficult a lot of the time to understand our emotions, because we have so many, and they hold so many messages. But a really helpful way of thinking about emotions, and one of the most kind of fundamental ways of thinking about them, is that they all have messages for us. They're all telling us something. You're not feeling sad without any reason. You're not afraid for no reason. You're not experiencing disgust or frustration or awe or gratitude. There are reasons for why all of these things are happening. And it's important to keep in mind that all these emotions have a function and that all of them hold a message as well. And it's really important to know what that message is. And talking about kind of antiquity and in ancient times, it's very likely that the emotions of anger and fear are among our oldest emotions, if not the oldest emotions, probably together with disgust, because disgust had such a fundamental, urgent message, which was, don't eat that, or don't drink that, or don't touch that, right? So danger. Anger and fear are right up there with disgust. They're some of our oldest emotions. At this point, probably two of the most difficult ones to detect sometimes, but to process as well, which is why I also like to bring them up, and I always like to isolate them a little bit from the rest. I always mention the Disney Pixar film Inside Out whenever I talk about emotional intelligence, so I have to mention it here as well. If you haven't seen it, I would really recommend that you go and watch it. Because the creators of that animated film did an excellent job of showing how anger and fear interact with each other. They're very special friends. They have a very special relationship, and they really know how to pick at each other so to speak, in very interesting ways. And what I've always found is that both with my younger clients and with my adult clients as well, it's been incredibly helpful to talk a little bit about that film, Inside Out, and kind of help them notice how anger and fear interact. Like I said, they are the oldest, or one of the oldest emotions. Their development, again, had to do with coping and surviving and protecting and saving and staying safe. And so they're incredibly important. And one of the reasons why I also always make sure to mention them and to really highlight them is because a lot of the times we have this kind of incorrect perception or goal of trying to remove them completely from our emotional landscape, or just not feel them at all, not experience them. And so I always want to share this and want to share the value of these emotions with you and how important they've been, and that it's really thanks to them that we're kind of sitting here together, although virtually, because we've survived all these hundreds of thousands of years thanks to these two emotions. And so when it comes to anger and fear in particular, it's really not about removing them. It's not about getting rid of them. Short of having brain surgery, you can't really do that anyway. But it's really about knowing how to channel them and what to do with them as and when they come up, because they will come up. They're wired into our system. They're not going anywhere. And I think in in today's world, given everything that is going on with this pandemic, with this lockdown, with quarantine, it's really important to address these emotions head on, to really kind of accept them, to embrace them, to talk about them, and then to figure out what we're going to do with them. So this question comes from a recent study that was done by the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. I would highly recommend that you follow that organization if you don't. The head of that organization is Mark Brackett, who recently wrote and published an incredibly important book in this field of emotional intelligence called Permission to Feel. So I would absolutely encourage you pick up that book and that you follow him as well. But what his team did, what his center did, was they spoke to about 5,000 teachers, a little over 5,000 teachers in the United States, and they asked them the same question. And I encourage you, as you're kind of listening to me, as you're looking at this slide, to think about this question as well and kind of answer it for yourself too. If you'd like to, you can share in the chat what the answer is for you. But the question was, what are the 3 most frequent emotions that you have experienced every day? Right? And they were really curious to know what were the emotions that were coming up during the past few months. So during this pandemic, the teachers, over 5,000 teachers who answered this question, gave 5 emotions. So they shared 5 emotions that they'd experienced during this period. But the 3 most frequent ones that they shared were feeling anxious, feeling fearful, and feeling worried. The other 2 were feeling overwhelmed and feeling sad. So anxiety by far was absolutely the most frequently mentioned emotion. And I'm sure that's true for many of you. I know it's absolutely been true for myself and most of the people who I know in both my personal and professional life. And anxiety, of course, fear, being worried, all of these emotions are attached to the emotion of fear. We also have overwhelmed and sad. Those are attached of course, to the emotion of sadness. A lot of people have also been reporting anger. And there was an article that came out, I believe, in the New York Times, perhaps yesterday or the day before, talking about the fact that a lot of people are experiencing anger and are not really able to regulate it very well at this point, which of course is completely understandable. But that is why it's incredibly important to directly address these emotions, the most uncomfortable ones, because it seems like maybe not all of the planet, but most of the planet is primarily experiencing the emotions that are attached to fear, to sadness, to anger. And so for me, not maybe the answer that may be too kind of big and large of a statement, but one of the options for how we can address these emotions in order to kind of build up, to create emotional health, is emodiversity. And this is a topic that I talked about 2 years ago at my TEDx talk in Singapore, which I would encourage you to look up on YouTube. If you just type in my name and emodiversity, it should pop up for you there. But I want to tell you a little bit about what emodiversity is, kind of how that concept came about, what it's about. And then I want to give you a couple of kind of concrete examples and sort of approaches to how we can diversify our inner emotional landscape. So the researchers who've looked into emodiversity, the reason why they were interested in this topic was because what they noticed, and this was an international team of researchers, they noticed that when you look around the world, the healthiest ecosystems on our planet seem to be the ones that are the most diverse in terms of both the flora and the fauna that exists within them. And so for them, this became a question of, is the same thing true? Do the same kind of rules apply when we look inward and when we look at our emotional landscape, when we look at our inner emotional ecosystem? Is it true that if we have really, really diverse emotions, if we're able to experience diverse emotions, that we are going to be more emotionally healthy? And so this isn't yet a very well researched area of psychology of emotional intelligence, but the research so far that has been done seems to indicate that yes, that is in fact the case. And in fact, for me, one of the most interesting findings, and one that I mentioned in my TEDx talk as well, which I think has a huge amount of potential, not just for your kind of everyday wellness, but for potentially mental health as well, is the fact that some of their research indicates that experiencing those really difficult emotions such as sadness and anger and fear in the moment and as they come up kind of in the short term can mean that in the long term we're a lot less likely to suffer from mental health issues such as anxiety disorders, depression, and a whole kind of host of other ones. I think that is incredibly important, and that is kind of the guiding principle behind emodiversity. It's about diversifying our emotions, and it's also about balancing out the ones that are not so pleasant and the ones that feel really, really good. And so when I talk about emotional diversity skills, what I mean really is creating this balance between the negative and positive emotional states that you experience on whether it's a daily or a weekly or a monthly basis. Sometimes it can be very challenging to do this on a daily basis, and so often I recommend that people look at kind of their weekly, their kind of weekly emotional ecosystem, if you will, and start from there. So when it comes to negative emotional states, it's really about embracing them, not increasing them, right? So I'm not saying that if you are generally a pretty kind of happy person, you are able to experience a lot of positive emotional states. I'm not saying that you then need to look at that and go, oh, you're not balanced out with the negative. You need to up the negative and experience more negative emotions. It's absolutely not that. Balance or emotional balance is still an individual thing, right? Unless we're severely off balance, we're always kind of on that seesaw a little bit, right? It's not a stationary thing. It's a dynamic thing. It's a constant trying to kind of strike that balance. And so obviously, if you're really in touch with those positive emotional states and you're really able to diversify positive emotional states and experience them, that's wonderful. The important thing is that when the more kind of negative, difficult, heavy emotional states happen, that you're still able to embrace them, that you're not trying to push them down or push them away or hide them or ignore them or pretend that they don't exist or pretend that you're going to try to kind of permanently remove feelings such as sadness and anger and all of the other ones, right? So the first step is to really name whatever that negative emotional state is as specifically as you can. The second aspect of that is understanding where that's coming from. Again, what is the message in there? And then regulating it. So what am I going to do with this negative emotional state? What are the actions that I'm going to take? And I give you this example. I will share this link in the comment box as soon as I'm done with the slides. This is a really wonderful resource that I always encourage everybody to check out. It's called the Atlas of Emotions, and it was developed by a couple of the most prolific EQ researchers in the world, their father and daughter team, Doctors Ekman, and they had the blessing of His Holiness the Dalai Lama when they created this. And they had a huge amount of input from him. They're currently working on a children's version of this, so this is just for adults. And this shows you one of the kind of graphs that you'll find on their website. So this looks at sadness and kind of opens it up to show you the number of different kind of sub emotions or sub-emotional states that are all foundationally connected to sadness. But it's really important that we get really specific about which one of these we feel in any given situation, because of course, how you then regulate and how you understand it is going to be very different if what you're experiencing is disappointment as compared to grief. And so I always like to give personal examples just to help people kind of understand things and see how this is applicable. So in my case, and this has been impacted by COVID, I used to spend pretty much every single day in Manhattan. I live just across the river, the Hudson River. For our non-American friends, that means I live in New Jersey. But I used to spend every single day in New York City, and I loved it. I think it's a magical place. I haven't been inside Manhattan in about 4 months at this point. And of course, as for many of us, the question of returning back to normal, if that's going to happen and when that's going to happen, is very relevant for me too. And so I hold a lot of sadness around that and experience a lot of sadness because of it. And when I look at this chart of sadness, one of the things that I've been doing is getting very specific about what I'm feeling and just really sitting with it, accepting it. Again, embracing the fact that I'm experiencing this for very good reason. And so when I look at this chart, there's definitely a disappointment that's there, but I know I can tell that it's a lot more than that. It's not just a disappointment. And so in my case, it goes up all the way to very intense sadness-based emotions, such as both grief and sorrow on certain days. On certain days, it's not quite as intense, it's not quite as blue, but on certain ones, it's both grief and sorrow. And those are the moments in which I just have to embrace that, the fact that these emotions are coming up. And luckily, when I look out of my window, I can see Manhattan, so I'll do that sometimes as well, as part of me regulating those emotions, right? But that's one of the examples for when we're experiencing sadness-based, fear-based, whatever kind of emotion it is, to really understand what it is and to understand where it's coming from and what the reason is. On the other hand, we have the positive emotional states, and when it comes to them, it's really all about choosing and amplifying those states. First of all, knowing what they are, which is why I've listed some of them for you here. There are many more, but if you need to, you can always come back to this list and think in terms of, have I experienced joy today or this week? Have I experienced some sense of pride? Have I been compassionate to myself or to other people, right? Sometimes it can take a little bit of work if this doesn't come naturally for us, but these are some of the positive emotional states. And the pictures I shared with you here are related to the emotion of awe in particular. A lot of research has been done on that emotion at the University of California at Berkeley. It's called the Greater Good Science Center within the university. I encourage you follow their work as well. And they found that there are certain different ways of experiencing awe, or certain circumstances that really help us experience awe and get in touch with awe. And I've only shared a couple of them with you here. The second picture actually on the right hits two of those points, two of those circumstances. On the left, we have nature, which is a little bit difficult to do now, but still doable for a lot of us. Being outside in nature seems to induce that emotion of awe. And then on the right, what you see is St. Peter's Cathedral in Vatican City in Italy. This one represents both a kind of religious, spiritual experience, which has been shown to induce awe, but it's also about art, or at least for me it is, and that's why I shared this picture. It's one of my just kind of favorite places in the world, really. But it combines both religion and art. And the appreciation of art, you can see down there, I have aesthetic appreciation, also seems to induce this sense of awe. The four emotional states that I highlighted there are particularly and especially pro-social ones. And we know that anytime that we can share positive emotional states with others, that just automatically amplifies them. And so emotions like gratitude, like kindness, like admiration and compassion include other people. And so these are the emotional states that, again, especially given what is going on right now, we want to try and experience as much as we possibly can. And again, if you're a parent watching us, as much as you can include your children in this and teach them also how to experience these emotional states intentionally and on purpose and consciously and very mindfully, the better it's going to feel and the more it's going to amplify that positive emotional state, both for yourself and for your child as well. And so the way I conceptualize kind of inducing these, this is to do with the positive emotional states, right, related to positive emotional states, is really creating a kind of blueprint, or almost creating a kind of plan, a kind of general plan for these different positive emotional states, so that you really know essentially what it takes to experience these emotional states. And so I break them down into the who, the what, the where, your thoughts, and miscellaneous when it comes to particular emotion. And so if we look at something like awe, the first question that we ask is who would we like to have there in order to experience that emotion? And it may be no one. It may just be yourself, right? So it doesn't matter. When it's a more pro-social emotion, you may want to have other people there. Otherwise, it's fine if it's just you. And again, given physical distancing, it may be a little bit tricky to do some of these at this point, but we just need to kind of augment them a little bit and edit them. So the who is going to be a part of this experience for you. The what is what are you going to be doing, or what do you need to be doing or want to be doing in order to experience that emotion. So from the previous slide, the example that I gave you is Vatican City. And St. Peter's Church there, which is, like I said, one of my favorite places. So I can't physically go there right now, obviously, but one of the things that I do when I want to experience aesthetic appreciation and awe, those two things for me at least are connected, is look at pictures of St. Peter's, or look at photos of the art inside St. Peter's, or watch a movie or documentary that was filmed there, right? So that would be my what. Where do you need to be, or where do you want to go when this is happening? Again, in this particular case, because so many of us are physically distancing, the where may be your living room, or maybe your dining room, or it may be your favorite chair in the house, it may be your bed, it may be your kitchen, it may be your backyard, your front yard, right? Wherever that happens to be. Thoughts are incredibly important here, and I'm going to be talking about thoughts, I believe, in the third episode of the series, the third or fourth one, forgive me if I'm wrong. But what are the thoughts that are going to be going through your head when you are in that state? And this is incredibly important to ask this question, because our thoughts and our emotions are very, very closely connected, and they really influence each other. They change each other. When you change a thought, you change an emotion, and vice versa as well. So again, in my example, say if it's looking at some of those pictures of St. Peter's Cathedral, my thoughts will revolve around how beautiful it is and how incredible it is that somebody was so inspired to create a structure like that, or a piece of art like that. How amazing it is that somebody had that really strong sense of faith and that kind of religious compass in order to be so inspired to create something beautiful like that, right? So most of the thoughts around awe and aesthetic appreciation will revolve around that. So again, you can probably sense the level of positivity that's involved in all of this, and the kind of nourishing that it really, really provides, that inner nourishing. The final one is miscellaneous, and that can be things like, what is the drink that you want to have kind of with you while you're experiencing this? Is there anything particular that you'd want to wear? So in this case, I very intentionally wore this kind of corally color top, because I knew I was going to be talking to you about emotions, and I wanted to kind of amplify and intensify that experience, both for myself as I kind of see myself on the screen, but for you as well as you're watching me, right? So that would fit into kind of the miscellaneous category. So anything else that you can think of really that you would want and that you would need to really amplify that experience. That is really what we're doing with all of this, with asking the who and the what and the where, and what thoughts will we be thinking, and what are the other things that we want to have. It's really about creating those positive emotional states, and it's about amplifying them as well. And as we kind of slowly wrap up, again, like I said before, I would love for you to share if you have any comments or questions about what I was talking about. This is a very kind of simple statement, but one that I like to repeat over and over again when it comes to our emotions, and one that I want to finish off with today, and that is that emotions really matter. And I don't think we are not fully aware of that, but I don't think we're as aware of that as we really need to be in order to learn how to regulate our emotions a lot better, and learn how to diversify our inner emotional landscape, and just to improve our own emotional health and the emotional health of other people. I also always like to say that emotions happen both inside of us, they happen outside of us, they happen between us as well. And so one of the reasons why emotions matter so much is that they really impact the quality of our relationships and the way in which we interact with other people. And so the more emotionally aware, the more emotionally intelligent, the more emotionally literate that we are when it comes to ourselves and our own inner emotional world, the better we're going to be at speaking that oldest language that we have, the language of emotions, with other people. And again, if you're a parent, that's one of the most important skills that I teach parents, which is emotional literacy and emotional intelligence, and being able to detect emotions in both themselves and in their children as well. Because again, if you're a parent, you know that children can provoke your emotions in the most interesting ways and in the ways that nobody else can. And in those moments, oftentimes our conscious brains tend to kind of shut down, and our awareness of what exactly is going on kind of dims a little bit and goes offline. And so it's incredibly important to switch that light on, and become more emotionally intelligent, become more emotionally literate. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up. We've gone a little bit over time today. Thank you guys so much. I'm just reading the comments here. Yep. So I appreciate Robert's comment on focus, on changing focus. That was one of the topics that I talked about during my first series on digital wellness, where I was talking a little bit about attention and about changing where we kind of direct our attention towards, shifting our attention. A lot of people have said that the quality of your life depends on the quality of your attention. And in neuroscience, we also say where attention goes, energy flows. And so really it's all about what you're paying attention to, about what you are focusing on in that moment. And that is really the idea behind emodiversity and emotional balance. It's really choosing to balance out that inner emotional landscape, to create a kind of rough balance between those unpleasant emotions that we really can't escape and that are simply there, and really try and amplify, so direct our focus towards amplifying those positive emotional states. And I want to just share with you the link. Hopefully that will go through. There it is. The link to the Atlas of Emotions. So this is an online website that I really encourage you to go to. If there are any other resources that you would like me to share with you, please feel free to either reach out to me via social media, or just send me an email as well. And I hope I will see you next week, when we're going to be going back to that topic of digital wellness. And we're going to be talking a little bit about how to detangle ourselves from the digital in order to improve our wellness. And again, that has a huge impact on our inner emotional landscape. It has a huge impact on our emotions. And as a digital wellness practitioner, I'm a huge advocate for using our emotions as a starting point for managing our digital wellness, and for managing how we use technology, why we use it, when we use it, how much of it we use, and so on. But we're going to dig in a little bit deeper into that next week on Monday the 27th, again, same time and same place. So thank you guys again, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.